The M1340 and its later variant, the M1441, evolved from a series of light tanks with which Italian tank development had been mostly concerned. Lightly armoured and underpowered, the tank was only really effective against soft targets. Indeed, in its general configuration, it betrayed design influences which were more suited to a colonial policing role than modern armoured warfare. The 47mm gun, although adequate in 1940, could not be upgraded, and the four-man tank carried an excessive number of machine guns. Early models also lacked desert filters, and their engines suffered heavily from the corrosive effect of sand. Large numbers were captured intact after having broken down, and were pressed into predictably short service by the British. M13s and 14s equipped 3 Italian armoured divisions, all of whom would see service in North Africa. The 88 entered service with the Wehrmacht in 1933 as a high-velocity anti-aircraft gun, but by 1942 had become the most feared anti-tank gun in the German arsenal. Although the 88 was first used against ground targets during the war in Spain, it was Rommel who first recognized the true potential of the 88 as an anti-tank weapon, employing it in adversity in France, and then modifying it for use as a pure anti-tank gun in North Africa. Whereas the British had always regarded anti-tank guns as defensive weapons, Rommel employed them in an offensive role, attaching mobile batteries to panzer groups. Time and again, British tank formations would be drawn into pursuing retreating German armour, only to find themselves impaled on a screen of 88s. In 1940, in the skies over Britain, the Junkers 87, or Stuka, had suffered heavily when engaged by single-engine fighters. But in ill-defended skies, it still remained a truly awesome weapon. As a dive bomber, the Stuka was highly accurate, and its attack sirens added terror to its more conventional repertoire. In the first years of the war, the screaming Stuka had achieved international notoriety and a reputation far beyond its actual capabilities. In North Africa, it had often benefited from German air superiority, and in such conditions was employed to devastating effect. In 1941, an improved version was brought into service, which had greater armour protection, a more powerful engine, and an increased payload. At Alamein, where the RAF held dominance in the air, the Stuka would not play a major role, but in support of an Axis withdrawal or against Allied forces in French North Africa, it was still capable of inflicting serious damage. Despite the recent setbacks at Alamein and the approaching British offensive, the German soldiers in Rommel's Panzer Army remained confident of his leadership. Many were campaign veterans who had grown accustomed to the hardships and privations of desert service. They were generally well-trained, courageous and professional, and regarded themselves as an elite. Replacements, when they arrived, were incorporated within existing formations and units, learning the tricks of desert living and the techniques of survival from their comrades. But at Alamein, these normally difficult conditions were exacerbated by a serious water shortage. Virtually no fresh water was available at the front. Most of what there was came from old wells and storage cisterns on the desert coast and was often polluted. Water rations were barely sufficient for the army's needs. Drinking water was in short supply, and there was little left for washing or sanitation. Personal hygiene suffered, and jaundice and dysentery were common. Yet if the Germans were able to endure these difficulties with fortitude, the same could not be said of their comrades in arms. Italian morale had all but collapsed. The obvious inferiority of their equipment and the humiliations they had endured at the hands of the British were compounded now by disillusion, epidemics, and the recognition that they had become very much the junior partners in the alliance. It was these ill-equipped and predominantly infantry troops that would have to bear much of the force of Montgomery's planned offensive in the northern sector. As the final contest for North Africa loomed, Hitler's campaign in southern Russia was grinding slowly to a halt. The drive to the Volga had become bogged down in a desperate battle for the city of Stalingrad. And in the Transcaucasus, the retreating Red Army had established a defensive front among the ridges and peaks of the Caucasus Mountains. The range stretched east to west for nearly 700 miles, and the few mountain passes that existed were heavily defended. By October, snow and ice had made them virtually impregnable. There was now no prospect of a drive south into Persia in 1942.
As the German-Italian Panzer Army prepared to meet the coming British offensive at El Alamein, the tide of battle in the central Mediterranean was at last beginning to turn. Throughout the first half of 1942, the island of Malta had been brought almost to its knees by a combination of air raids and attacks on convoys bringing essential supplies. In August, the Pedestal convoy, the most heavily protected merchant convoy ever to sail, ran the gauntlet between Gibraltar and Valletta. Of the 14 merchant ships that set out, only 5 reached the Maltese port, but the supplies they carried were sufficient to maintain Malta in the fight. In October, the air attacks increased in intensity, in a last desperate attempt to bludgeon the island into submission. But again the offensive failed, and after 8 days of savage fighting, the Axis daylight raiders were driven off. The survival of Malta as a strategic air and naval base astride the main Axis lines of communication would ensure that the Panzer Army continued to suffer the chronic shortages that had blunted its drive through Egypt and brought it to a halt at Alamein in the summer. On the eve of the Battle of Alamein, the Panzer Army suffered from several disadvantages. Among them, the absence of its long-serving and highly respected commander.